Welcome to the Journal Editorial Report as we remember the life and the legacy of George H.W. Bush. The 41st president died Friday at the age of 94. I'm Paul Gigot, and with me in studio is Wall Street Journal columnist and deputy editor Dan Henninger. So, Dan, George H.W. Bush was the first president I covered full-time in Washington. It's quite an extraordinary event to recall his presidency. And I think the word that's often used is a character to describe George H.W. Bush. He lived by a set of values, personal and political and professional, that stood him very well, and the country as well.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, he came from New England, good Puritan stock. People said the same thing after Barbara Bush died. And the two of them both represented kind of stalwart, stern, in some ways, modest character that one associated with New England from the founding of the country onward to a lot of these families. Bush was from a very famous political family, went to Yale, went to a prep school in New England, but finally went off to find his own way after enlisting in the Navy, World War II. He went to make his career in Texas, and back then, Texas was still the frontier. So he was a risk taker. So
you talked to two things there, and I want to talk about the military background. He enlisted at 18, all right, at World War II, extraordinary. You had a conversation, you mentioned to me earlier, with a current member of the military, talking about how much they revere George H.W.'s record. Tell me about that.
Yeah, I was talking to a friend of mine who's a former fighter pilot in the Navy, flew off aircraft carriers in Iraq, and he was telling me that to this day, George Bush remains a revered and iconic figure in the Navy, especially among the fighter pilots. Not merely because he enlisted at the age of 18 to fight in World War II, but George W. Bush flew something called a torpedo bomber, which was essentially a flying truck. It had very little maneuverability, and the torpedo bombs had to be dropped at a low altitude, flying straight at the target. It was the only way you could ensure accuracy. So that made these torpedo bombers extraordinarily vulnerable to anti-aircraft fire. A lot of them experienced casualties. As we know, George Bush was hit once, had to bail out. His crew was killed. He flew 58 combat missions. At one other point, had to crash land that plane on water. And this young fellow was saying, around the Navy, George H.W. Bush, as a fighter pilot, is a legendary figure, and they all know who he was and what he did.
Well, I want to stress, too, I think, for viewers, the Texas Bush, because when you grow up in Yale, when you go to prep school, when you grew up in the family he did, he could have gone to Wall Street and kind of done what most of his classmates did. Instead, he went to Texas, made his way as an oil man. And as you say, that was a really risk-taking entrepreneurial venture. And of course, I think that part of his personality wasn't as fully understood by a lot of people because they saw the clubby Bush. Yeah. They saw the elite Bush, the Kennebunkport Bush. This was the North Texas Bush and the Houston Bush. And that's a very, I mean, in that way, he was a very complicated man.
Yeah, and you know, he could have also gone straight into politics. He came from a political family. The Bush name was not established by him, but by his father, Prescott Bush. And instead, he decided to go down there with Barbara and first try to make his fortune. It was only after he was in Texas that he decided to get into public service.
Let's talk about his public service, because as vice president, I think one thing that I remember when I was covering him as vice president a little bit was that in the later years was that he was extraordinarily loyal to Ronald Reagan as a vice president. Right. And there was you didn't hear a lot of the infighting. They had a very good relationship. And then he carried that over to Dan Quayle, when Dan Quayle, who was vilified, remember, when he picked Dan Quayle as his running mate, and turned out to be actually a very good president, wrote a fine piece for us this week about his memories of George W. Bush and how George H.W. Bush and how well he treated Dan Quayle.
Yeah. Yeah, that's something worth remembering. But Bush succeeded a great president, a larger-than-life figure like Ronald Reagan, and then established himself in his own presidency. And it was not an easy transition. I mean, the Quayle was the 1992 Republican convention in Houston. recall?
Yeah.
You and I attended that.
I remember.
That was not a placid event at all. The religious right was rising. Pat Buchanan had been attacking Bush at the time, and there was sort of this opposition emerging from the right. George Bush had to somehow manage his way through that and did so very successfully.
All right. Well, I think, remember, I think you're thinking 1988.
1988, right.
Well, so his, let's talk about his presidency briefly. I think biggest mark was foreign policy, the peaceful collapse of the Soviet Union. I think his major achievement was the peaceful unification of Germany. Europeans hold him in very high regard for that. Also, the way he used personal diplomacy and his long experience and personal connections to be able to negotiate that and win the trust of Gorbachev because he didn't brag. What about his domestic record?
Well, his domestic record was a little bit more mixed. It was attached famously to his campaign pledge, no new taxes. One of the most famous phrases in American political history, famous partly because he violated it. But we have to remember that he had George Mitchell as the majority leader then, fighting him every step of the way, in some ways presaging the politics we would see after George Bush.
That became a more partisan era. Thank you, Dan. When we come back, President Trump.
Modern day agreement. We've worked hard on this agreement. It's been long and hard. We've taken a lot of barbs and a little abuse, and we got there. It's great for all of our countries.
That was President Trump Friday at the G20 in Buenos Aires, Argentina, taking a victory lap as the United States, Mexico, and Canada signed a new trade agreement known as the USMCA. The president, who made replacing NAFTA a cornerstone of his first term, touted the new pact as a big win for American workers. But the fight is not over yet as the deal now makes its way through Congress. Pennsylvania Senator Pat Toomey joins me now. Welcome, Senator.
Thanks, Paul. Thanks for having me.
Good to have you here. So you've looked at this new agreement. Can you support it in its current form?
No, not in its current form, Paul. No, I think the problem is the net effect of it is it diminishes the opportunity for trade among the three countries, and the whole idea is, of course, to maximize the freedom to trade. It does that in a variety of ways that are problematic for me. One is an expiration date. I don't know why in the world you'd put an expiration date on a free trade agreement.
6 years, isn't this?
Well, it's 16, but
you review it after 6.
You review it after 6 with no assurance that it'll be extended at that point. I think that's a significant problem. I really don't like what amount to country-specific rules of origin with respect to autos and auto parts. The whole idea behind this is a continental-wide free trade zone where you'd have continental rules of origin, I understand that, but not country-specific. They use a minimum wage as their proxy for achieving that. It's a bad idea, I think. They also virtually destroy the independent mechanism for adjudicating disputes between an investor and a government, right? The investor-state dispute settlement mechanism. We have had that in every single trade agreement but one. And it's really important because sometimes the host country does things to disadvantage an American investor, and they can do it in a lot of ways, and we don't always get a fair hearing in their courts.
Now, you suggested in our pages last week that in order to prevent this deal from going into the Democratic House and getting even worse, you would like to see the president get it passed in this lame duck session. Does that have any chance now?
It's looking like the clock is about run out on that because there is a 30-day delay between the time that the administration would submit the final text of the agreement, which they could do, they could have done by now, and the time we can actually vote on it. So I've been urging the administration, this is a free option. Send the agreement to us. Work with us meaning, and I'm thinking about the free trade Republicans.
Right.
It might be that Democrats would be offended by this expedited process. Maybe you lose Democrat support, but there are enough Republicans to pass this under TPA exclusively. It would have to move in a pro-trade direction, but you could get a huge victory for the president by the end of the year.
Well, you know, one of the reasons that Robert Lighthizer said they could get this through Democratic Congress is they'd have union support. I looked at United Auto Workers' statement on Friday, and it said not adequate as currently exists. I looked at the environmental groups. Right. They're opposed to it. Right. Chuck Schumer issued a statement saying, well, we got to have climate change thing added to it. I mean, are we going to see this pass a Democratic House?
So I'm very skeptical about this, right? Under what scenario is this a high priority for Nancy Pelosi to pass Donald Trump's NAFTA 2.0? I don't see it. And by the way, we've seen this movie before, right? Where a Republican president sends Speaker Pelosi a new free trade agreement, and what did she do? She just did nothing.
George W. Bush, Colombia,
Correct.
Peru, Panama, and South Korea all kicked off until Republicans retook the House.
Yeah, and she was very open about it. It was like, well, we might use this for leverage on other things, but it was not important to her, and she never moved the legislation at all.
So how many members of the Republican Senate agree with you?
You know, I'm not sure what the number is, Paul. You never know that sort of thing. I can tell you that there were 12 of us that signed the letter urging the president to send the document to us so that we can at least have a chance to move it in the direction of freer trade and get this done this year. I believe it's safe to say there are more senators who are sympathetic with that approach and might have chosen not to sign the letter for a variety of reasons. But, you know, Republicans in the Senate are overwhelmingly pro-trade.
Right.
Overwhelmingly. And everybody understands that this has moved in an unfortunate direction. The question now is, does it go anywhere with Nancy Pelosi holding the House? And if so, how much worse?
All right, let's turn to another subject before you go, and that is this vote in the Senate this week to essentially open the Lee-Sanders bill that would cut off American funding for the Saudis' war in Yemen. That's now going to go to the Senate next week for debate. Right. You voted against the administration's wishes to send this vote for debate. Right. Why?
Because I think we need to have a debate. I think the administration has really not handled the assassination of Khashoggi well at all. I do not share the view that the U.S. has to withdraw the very, very limited advice and training that we're providing the Saudis.
Which is targeting advice in part.
And there's no doubt in my mind, it has reduced civilian casualties. The war in Yemen is a horrific, horrific humanitarian crisis, no doubt about it. But it could have been worse. It could still be worse. And with the absence of U.S. involvement, both to better train the Saudis on being precise and avoiding civilian casualties, but also pressuring the Houthis to get to the table and to begin negotiating.
But this Lee-Sanders bill would cut off funding.
So it would. Why? So I don't agree with the substance of that, but I do think we have to have a debate on the Senate floor and get this administration to acknowledge that we have to both defend and promote American interests and remind the world, including our allies, that there are certain values that we're going to hold and we're going to insist that other people recognize.
And you don't think the administration has upheld that balance?
I think they've not struck that balance at all. When the Crown Prince, the de facto head of state of Saudi Arabia, he has to accept ultimate responsibility for that assassination. Whether or not we have a smoking gun and can prove that he actually issued an order and a text that we can identify, look, that's not important. What's important is the assassins all reported to him. They were part of an organization that he controls. He has to accept responsibility. There has to be some accountability. And to instead suggest, well, they buy a lot of weapons from us, so, you know, we're going to say nothing about it, that's just wrong. And that does not further our interest in the long run either. So some of us felt like this is a tool that we have in the Senate to address this issue, get their attention, and hopefully get a better balance.
All right, Senator, we'll follow that debate. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
When we come back, Nancy Pelosi is one step closer to reclaiming the Speaker's gavel as Democrats fall into line behind the Democratic leader. Plus, another guilty plea for former Trump attorney Michael Cohen and what it could mean for the Mueller probe.
Very simply, Michael Cohen is lying, and he's trying to get a reduced sentence for things that have nothing to do with me.
Morning. What do we got?
Keep an eye on that branch. It might get windy. Have a good shift.
Fire pit, last use 0600. I'd stay.
Her personal attorney, Michael Cohen, pleads guilty to lying to Congress about negotiations in 2016 for a Trump Tower in Moscow. This as Nancy Pelosi moves one step closer to regaining the Speaker's gavel, with House Democrats tapping her Wednesday as their party's nominee when the 116th Congress convenes in January. We're back with Dan Henninger, Wall Street Journal editorial page writer Kate Batchelder-Odell, and Wall Street Journal columnist and Manhattan Institute senior fellow Jason Riley. All right, Dan, so how does the Cohen guilty plea change the narrative, if at all, the Russia-Trump collusion story?
I don't think it changed the narrative very much, Paul, from what we've been watching. I mean, what we have known since the beginning of this investigation is that Robert Mueller would like to nail Donald Trump. And at this point, Michael Cohen would like to stay out of jail. It's a marriage made in hell, quite frankly, and both sides are playing their appointed roles. We knew about Trump's deal, proposed deal with the tower in Moscow back in late 2015 through 2016. All Cohen has added is that there may have been, he says, more involvement by Trump in that deal.
And that it extended for a longer period
of time.
Into June of 2016, whereas Trump, let's be candid here, had given the impression that there was no real extensive discussions. Cohen says, actually, there were more extensive discussions, and they lasted longer.
But it's difficult to identify a crime in the center of Cohen's pleading. The optics are pretty terrible. A person running for the presidency of the United States probably should not be doing simultaneous deals with people in Moscow that we know about Donald Trump. But I don't think they've moved the ball. I'm very struck, Paul, by how many of these pleas, now that it's all kind of coming together, Roger Stone, Michael Flynn, it's all about lying to federal prosecutors or the FBI. We know that's a crime. We know it's a serious crime. It's a long way, though, from identifying a discrete event that establishes collusion.
Does it show collusion? No. Does it show that Russian interference tipped the election to Donald Trump? No. But we also know Mueller's looking at obstruction of justice, Paul. And so the question is not
firing Comey.
Right. So the question is not just whether Cohen was lying, but if he was lying at the direction of Donald Trump. And that could be one of the paths that Mueller is pursuing with this.
Well, how would we, but Trump denies that he did any such thing like that. And what, have you seen any evidence so
We have
far?
not. We haven't.
Because merely firing Comey itself is not obstruction of justice, because I think, at least I would argue, because he can fire anybody he wants who's an inferior officer. So the only way you would be able to suggest that would be if he somehow had a corrupt motive. And even then, I think people would argue that that's better, that's not a crime, that's maybe impeachable, and fight over that. So, I mean, but I'm looking for how Cohen has changed any of this.
We don't know. We don't know yet. It's just too early to tell, I think.
Okay, all right. Let's turn now, Kate. Let's talk about Pelosi. Nancy Pelosi making a big leap forward in her plans to become Speaker of the House. What happened to all of that opposition? Seemed to have melted away. I mean, she did get 32 votes against her, but nothing to really put her speakership in jeopardy.
That's right, Paul. I mean, Nancy Pelosi has this quality about her that is almost like Lyndon Johnson, right? She's very good at consolidating power and has a relentless will to it. I think one lesson here for the Democrats is that if you're going to try to dethrone Nancy Pelosi, you had better succeed, and here they did not. She will not even discuss the possibilities of a successor because she doesn't want to be a lame duck speaker. So I think this was a real mistake on Democrats' part if they did not have the ability to follow through.
Well, and Jason, I think one of the big stories here is the political left is really behind Nancy Pelosi. I mean, you've got MoveOn.org, you've got a lot of the left-wing activist groups that have said, don't you dare vote against her or we will, in fact, challenge you with the primaries.
That's true, Paul, but I do think there are some divisions still here on the left. You know, the Democrats are going to take over more than a couple dozen committees with oversight responsibilities. Will Nancy Pelosi be able to rein in Jerry Nadler or Adam Schiff or Maxine Waters, people that have been itching to investigate into submission this presidency since day one, and who promised their constituents that is what they would do?
Does she want to rein him in?
She claims she wants to legislate, not investigate.
They always say that. They always say that. What they're going to say, we're going to legislate. Yeah, okay.
Next year is going to be total chaos, all right? It's between all of these investigations. You failed to mention Elijah Cummings, who's got about 100 subpoenas. Meanwhile, the President of the United States says if they do this, he will release a lot of classified documents relating to FISA warrants and so forth, which he says explicitly will embarrass the Democrats. Now, personally, I think this sort of chaos plays into the Democrats' hands because voters, independent voters, are getting tired of the chaos. It drives Democratic turnout. It drives Democratic fundraising. Pelosi's job will be to manage it, because too much of it, I think, could fall back and backfire on them the way it did on the Republicans during the Clinton impeachment 20 years ago.
Kate, briefly, you know, all those opponents of Pelosi, the Democrats who said in the campaign they wouldn't vote for her, are they just going to all melt away? Was that just a phony war?
Yes, Paul, they're going to find a way to massage that and basically say, well, you know, we discussed this with her and we had to come to a solution. We have to unite as a party. They'll find a way out of that one.
Okay, thanks. Still ahead, President Trump threatening to close the southern border after hundreds of migrants rush north. What the caravan clashes mean for the debate over U.S. asylum laws and for the battle over border wall funding playing out in Washington.
We're in negotiation. If we don't get border security, possible shutdown.
Clashes coming as lawmakers in Washington scramble to avoid a partial government shutdown over President Trump's demand for $5 billion in border wall funding. Negotiations are continuing, but the finger pointing has already begun.
If there's any shutdown, it's on President Trump's back. The Republicans are in control of the presidency, the House, and the Senate. A shutdown is on their back. Stick to the $1.6 billion.
Our bill contains the president's full request for the border, but ultimately the president and the Senate Democrats are going to have to come to agreement as well.
We're back with Dan Henninger, Mary Anastasia O'Grady, and Jason Riley. So, Mary, was the response appropriate to the storming of the border, the use of tear gas and attempts to stop them?
Yeah, I think it was, and let's remember that it wasn't it was a pepper spray that is non-lethal and so forth. But I think that, you know, they had to send a clear signal that you cannot bum rush the border with, you know, thousands of people, because you need every country in the world has some kind of immigration procedures, and we have immigration procedures. We have procedures for people claiming asylum. When there's this volume, it's not manageable, and because of that, they had to basically enforce the law.
And there's something of a precedent for what happens when these protocols are ignored. We have the situation in Europe with Germany dealing with, and other Western European nations dealing with people bum rushing the border and the rule of law being cast aside.
Well, let's just elaborate on that. 1 million migrants from the Middle East in 2015 came into Germany. Angela Merkel said out of compassion they will be allowed in. But the political backlash of that has actually hurt the cause of immigration.
Yes, it has hurt the cause of immigration, and that the people who support immigration and a lot of us sitting at this table strongly support legal immigration, are hurt most when the protocols are ignored. There are legitimate refugees seeking asylum, and what we don't want are fake refugees mixing in among them, people who have no real right to claim of asylum, getting in the mix and not providing enough slots for the people who do have legitimate claims.
Yeah, and let's remember, too, that this is unprecedented. So we haven't dealt with this before, and the system we have in place cannot handle this volume of people. Now, the Trump administration is trying to make a deal with Mexico in which they'll keep them there and then process them in batches as they can. There are certain legal challenges to that. We'll see what the courts decide, whether that's legal or not.
And one question about that asylum deal is whether the Trump administration is doing it in good faith to, in fact, process these people through, or simply wants to suppress the number of asylum processes that do come through. In other words, make them line up. They never get in. They go away. The question is, do they want an immigration policy, or do they simply want to keep all the immigrants out of the southern border or anywhere in the United States?
But look, I mean, they have to send, Mary, I think you would agree with this, but let me know, an incentive. You can't say, come on in, everybody has a right to come in. You don't want to send a message to people to go to the border and think they can get asylum if their chances are really, really low.
Well, as I said, I agree. And as I said, the asylum procedures right now cannot handle this volume of people. But I think, as we've talked about over the years, the problem is that we don't have an immigration system whereby people can apply and get green cards in a reasonable period of time. We need labor. We need children. We don't make them anymore. And we need to import them. And so it's not a problem. We need the immigration, but there's no procedures in place to do it in an orderly process, either by this asylum process or by the normal green card process, where people wait for a decade to find out.
All right, Dan, let's talk about the wall fight, the wall funding fight, the border fight, security. Trump wants $5 billion over a couple of years. Schumer says $1.6. they going to find a deal or shut down?
Well, I don't think the shutdown is a very serious threat anymore. By and large, most Americans don't care. It's a partial shutdown. It will simply go forward. So
yeah,
Chuck
75% of the government is funded already.
And so you've got to make a deal between the $5 billion for the wall in the House bill and the $1.6 billion in the Senate bill. My guess is that probably they will come out in the center somewhere. The question is whether Donald Trump will accept anything under $5 billion. Now, the president did say, it wasn't well noticed, that if he didn't get the money, he has alternatives. Didn't say what those alternatives were, but he does have a plan B in mind to not getting his funding.
I guess, Jason, Donald Trump might think, look, with Nancy Pelosi taking over the House, this is my last shot to get that money.
He may be thinking that, but again, I think the president likes this issue. I really do. I think he thinks it works for him politically, helps him with his core base of supporters, and so I don't think he minds this fight. He'll have this fight. He'll fight on this for 2 months.
But I mean, he just fought over the caravan for a month before the election, and that was what he campaigned on. They lost 40 House seats. How is it working for him?
Especially Orange County, which in California, which should have gone his way if his immigration policies were really popular. I think he might think that he has an ace in the hole in the DACA decision that's going to hope.
The Dreamers.
Yes, the Dreamers who will be decided in the courts. Because if they decide against President Obama's decision to allow them to stay in the country, then he will think that he has a negotiating tactic there. Listen, I'll give you the Dreamers, you give me the wall. And I think that will be his fallback.
Even in the Democratic House. Yeah. Okay, still ahead, President Trump threatening to end subsidies to General Motors after the car company announced plans to cut term success. Holman Jenkins writes the Business World column for the Wall Street Journal. Welcome, Holman.
Hi, Paul.
So, what do you make of Barra's decision to shutter the plants? And
you know, ever since the bankruptcy, she really has done a good job of making use of the new freedom to run GM like a business. Get rid of the overexpensive labor contracts, get out of the business of making cars for markets like Europe where they can't make any money, get out of the business of making small cars where they can't make any money, and this is just more along those lines. Plus, she really signaled that she's worried about a downturn coming and she wants to preserve GM's capital so it can survive and continue to invest in new products through that downturn.
Now, when you say downturn, does this mean an overall recession potentially, or just a downturn in the auto market?
Well, the auto market's already turning down, although they're still making good money in it. But I think she's worried about, you know, the chaos in the Trump administration, the trade policy. I think she's worried about there's lots of financial crises hanging out there, Europe, China. So who knows? I think she's worried about the future of the economy.
So she wants to basically cut expenses that they think that aren't going to be profitable and refocus things on things that are.
The key is to keep investing through a downturn so you can meet other people with the new products and technology that are coming out.
And that's investing in what?
Electronics, self-driving stuff, but also fuel economy, because of the fuel economy mandates.
What do you make of Donald Trump's response to it? I guess not surprising.
Yeah.
But what do you make of it? Is there economic sense there?
It depends on what he does next. If he's just sounding off, you notice that he emphasized the word Ohio several times. That's a political calculation.
Sure, he's got to win Ohio in 2020.
Right. And if he's just signaling to his voters that I'm still on the case of jobs, 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 and keeps them on board for the things that are really working for the U.S. economy, like tax reform, like deregulation, like reforming the legal system, then I think that's okay. If he actually means what he says about threatening tariffs on cars, then that could be the source of the financial crisis and world meltdown that we're worried about.
But I think Trump would say, look, we did tax reform that cut your corporate rate. We bailed you out in 2008 and 9. We deregulated, make it easier for you. We reduced fuel economy standards that the Obama administration have set. Why can't all of this be enough to get you to build plants here?
Well, GM is expanding production here of some of its bigger vehicles. It's closing the plants that make small cars that consumers just aren't buying, and where even though GM's quality is on a par now with the Japanese still beat on reputation, and they do have a little bit of a cost advantage because they don't have the United Auto Workers in their southern plants. So that is a business where GM just can't make money, and it makes sense in any business to focus on those product lines where you can be successful.
So let's take electric subsidy point. They still get, we know we subsidize the purchase, the government does. does of every electric car purchase, I think is what, it's $7,500?
$7,500 until you run out of 200,000 cars.
200,000 cars. So, and I think GM is still below that.
Well below.
That. So what if we cut that off? Why are they getting subsidies anyway? I mean...
Well, the subsidies are partly to compensate them for the fuel economy mandates that require them to make electric cars. Electric cars get a lot of credit under the Obama fuel economy mandates, which offsets the expense of, the big vehicles where GM makes all its money, like the pickup trucks and the large SUVs. So the deal that the car companies cut with Washington is, all right, we'll meet your wish that we build electric cars, and you'll give us a lot of credit for those on the fuel economy rules. So it's a complicated bureaucratic morass that's going on, and GM is trying to protect its investment in that morass.
But I assume you'd support getting rid of the subsidies.
And the fuel economy.
And well, you've campaigned against those for about your entire life.
Look, I'd also be in favor of getting rid of the 25% import tariff on pickup trucks, which is how the big three run their business now. They're already running based on a protected domestic market.
But here's what Trump would say to that. That's worked. We're making trucks and SUVs here, and why can't we do the same on cars?
That's exactly what he's proposed. He'll be surprised by the result, because if you look at the top 20 cars sold in the U.S., there's 6 sedans in that ranking, and all 6 of them are made by the Japanese makers. They make them in the U.S. They would be the main beneficiaries of a new 25% tariff that would let them raise their prices like they did in 1981 when Reagan put import restrictions on Japanese cars. The price of Japanese cars went up in the U.S. The foreigners are the ones who made all the money from that. So
it wouldn't do any good for American workers in the end.
No, GM, Fiat, Chrysler's, and Ford's business is already built around the pickup truck tariff. So they're sitting pretty right now. They don't need more protectionism.
All right, Holman, thanks for coming in.
You bet.
Still ahead, President Trump urges lawmakers to pass criminal justice reform this year, but the bipartisan bill is at risk of stalling in Congress. We'll take a closer look.
I think we're going to have a vote, and I think we should do it now rather than later. This is something that could also pass later, but we have such a good group of people right now and such great support. I think you're better off. Let's take the victory for everybody, for Democrats and for Republicans.
That was President Trump this week at a roundtable discussion in Gulfport, Mississippi, urging lawmakers to vote on the First Step Act, the criminal justice reform championed by his daughter Ivanka and son-in-law Jared Kushner. Supporters hope to push the bipartisan bill through before the new Congress takes office in January. But the legislation is at risk of stalling as some Republicans voice their opposition. We're back with Jason Riley and Kate Batchelder-Odell. So, Kate, make the case for passing this bill.
Paul, I don't think this is a perfect bill, but I think it is an improvement over the status quo. It focuses on 2 things. First, on 4 small sentencing changes to how we sentence people, and also creates a system to encourage people to engage in productive behavior while they're in prison and potentially re-enter society and be able to contribute.
Okay. All right, Jason, you wrote a column expressing your displeasure with certain elements of it. What don't you like?
Well, I like some of the things that Kate was talking about, the prison reentry stuff. Most people in prison are going to get out one day, and we should do a better job of making sure they transition back into civil society properly. The problem here is with the sentencing so-called reforms in the bill. And these were not in the House version that passed. These are new to the Senate version, and it's why you're seeing more pushback from some senators. There's a reason why so many states have 3 strikes laws and truth in sentencing. Those are there because judges in the past proved themselves to be much too lenient, more lenient than legislators wanted them to be when they pass laws making sure people get locked up. We know that most of the crime that is committed by people who have already committed crimes, Paul. And when they get out, even if they have went in as a nonviolent offender, they'd always stay nonviolent. A Justice Department report released earlier this year found that within a decade, a third of people who were nonviolent criminals before had committed a violent offense. So people are concerned about dangerous people being released from prison sooner rather than later.
Okay, we should make clear this concerns federal law, not state criminal statutes. But Kate, why don't you take on that argument Jason made about mandatory minimums, is I guess the phrase people use.
Sure. I mean, Paul, one reason that what Jason describes is exactly right, that people reoffend and return to prison, is because we immerse them in this culture and don't encourage productive use of it. And like he says, he agrees with that. But on the mandatory minimum side, these are very modest changes. The discretion side that Jason's talking about for judges who have traditionally in the past misused some of that, there's something in the bill, there's something in existing law called the safety valve, which in certain cases allows judges to reduce minimums for those who are cooperating with law enforcement and have nonviolent pasts. This is a very modest extension of the existing safety valve, and the goal of it is to basically allow for prosecutors to go after higher level fentanyl kingpins and reward those who are working with law enforcement to bust drug conspiracies, to give them a slightly more modestly reduced time. But again, these kind of mandatory minimum reductions we're seeing here are very small. Again, the 3 strikes provision that's in the bill moves the 3rd strike from life to 25 years. And these are enhancements. They are not for the underlying crime. So we're talking about somebody being locked up for a very long time.
Jason.
When these guys get out, they typically head back to communities that are already racked with violence and all kinds of other mayhem. I think our sympathies should be with the law-abiding members of these communities.
Well, I think it is, Jason.
No, how are you helping law-abiding members of people in ghettos by sending these guys back home sooner rather than later? They do not need that in these communities.
Do you think that there are any cases of injustice regarding mandatory minimums just because of the fact that some judge, you'd like to have him sometimes be able to have discretion to say, you know, there are extenuating circumstances or other reasons for saying, you know what, in this case, we're not going to throw you away for life.
We've seen that movie. When they had the discretion, how did they use it? They abused it. And I'm against giving it back to them to do the same thing going forward. Do they bear any responsibility when the people that they let out early go back home and cause mayhem? Who pays the cost of that? The people in these communities, the law-abiding members of these communities who are the primary victims of these folks.
Kate, one of the arguments for this bill that's used is that it's based on reforms in Texas that were implemented at the state level for state criminal laws. What's the record there?
I mean, the record there, Paul, is pretty good. I mean, the state politicians basically decided to move some offenses to probation and invest more in how they use that time to use it productively. And they, over the past several years, have had a reduction in parole violations that result in a return to prison. And the violent crime rate is on the way down there, as well as the incarceration rate. They also use this risk assessment model that's in this bill that basically allows more individual tailoring to the circumstances involving an inmate and whether they are of risk of reoffending when they return to society.
Okay, last word, Jason, quickly.
The people who are opposing this, a lot of them come from rural states where this opioid epidemic has hit very hard, and there's a historical parallel here. Back in the 80s, when these initial sentences passed, it was at the urging of the Black Caucus members who were pushing them.
Okay, thank you, Jason. Thank you, Kate. We have to take one more.
America remembering our 41st president and his life of service to the nation, with funeral preparations underway in Texas and Washington to honor the legacy of President George Herbert Walker Bush. Hello, everyone, and welcome to a brand new hour inside America's News Headquarters. I'm Arthel Neville.
Hello, Arthel.
Hi, Eric.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. President George H.W. Bush will lie in state at the Capitol before his funeral service later this week in Washington. And of course, on this Sunday, tributes are continuing to pour in. Here is his former vice president, Dan Quayle, appearing on Sunday Morning Futures.
He was a great individual, in my opinion, a great president. He loved his family. He loved his work. He loved the country. And it was such an honor for me to work with him every single day that he was president, I was vice president, for the American people.
William Lajeunesse is live in College Station, Texas, home to the George H.W. Bush Presidential Library, where the president will be laid to rest alongside his wife, Barbara, and their 3-year-old daughter, Robin, who died of leukemia in 1953. Hello, William.
Hey, Eric. In fact, the museum had a line outside this morning. A lot of families parents wanting to explain to their kids the news and who George Bush was and how he changed history. There's a number of exhibits in there, some in chronological order, beginning when the Bushes moved out here to Texas for $300 a month, an entry-level job at an oil company. George Bush went on to own an oil company, but there's a story inside that he actually refused to sell the company to an individual for $400,000 less because he would not guarantee the workers that they would have their jobs once it was sold. That was one way to illustrate the humility, of course, the temperament, and the work ethic that typified 41.
Well, they talked a lot about President Bush and what he was like, and we learned a lot about life and death this weekend. We talked a lot about that, and talked a lot about what kind of man he was and what kind of man I want him to be.
Also, there is the George Bush School of Public Policy here on the campus of Texas A&M, and there was a vigil last night, if you will, where a lot of students...
President Trump called Michael Cohen, a, quote, weak person who's trying to get a reduced jail sentence. John?
Molly Henneberg in Washington, thanks. Former FBI Director James Comey striking a deal with House Republicans that will see him testify privately before the House Judiciary Committee. He had demanded it be in public. Comey's also dropping his challenge of the House subpoena. Here's current House Judiciary Committee Chairman Bob Goodlatte earlier on Sunday Morning Futures.
The format is one where our counsel will ask questions for an hour. The Democrats will have an opportunity to ask questions for an hour, then back to the Republicans and back and forth until all the questions have been asked that need to be asked. Whereas in a public hearing, if people have watched those, they know that each member gets 5 minutes.
Meantime, incoming House Judiciary Committee Chairman Gerald Nadler says Comey should testify in public. Take a listen.
The Republicans in this particular investigation have a history of having these in-camera interviews and then selectively leaking portions of the interview to give distorted view to the public of what happened. Let Comey testify in public.
Goodlatte, the Republican, says the closed-door interview with Comey will take place later this week. President Trump is back at the White House now following the two-day G20 summit in Argentina, but not before some last-minute deal-making with China last night for a temporary truce over trade. Ellison Barber joins us from outside the White House with details on this and how the president also wants the U.S. to ratify his new trade agreement with Mexico and Canada. Ellison.
Hey, John. So the president, according to the White House press secretary, President Trump and Chinese President Xi Jinping agreed to try and reach a deal within 90 days. And if they don't, tariffs will go up. So here's what the two presidents agreed to. Again, according to the White House press secretary, President Trump agreed to leave tariffs on $200 billion worth of Chinese goods at the 10% rate instead of raising it to 25% on January 1st, as previously planned. The White House says China agreed to, quote, purchase a not yet agreed upon but very substantial amount of products from the U.S. to try and reduce the trade imbalance. President Trump and President Xi reportedly agreed to immediately begin negotiations on structural changes for things like intellectual property rights and agriculture. If the two countries are unable to reach a deal within that 90 days, the White House says the 10% tariffs will be raised to 25%.
It'll have an incredibly positive impact on farming. China right now has major trade barriers. They have major tariffs and also major non-tariff barriers, which are brutal. China will be getting rid of many of them.
The White House says China also agreed to designate fentanyl as a controlled substance. On Air Force One last night, President Trump told reporters that it could be a game changer.
He's agreed to put it at the highest level of crime in this country. Therefore, if they get caught, they have the highest level of punishment. That could be a game changer.
The president talked about a number of topics as he and reporters flew back from Argentina. He told reporters that he plans to formally terminate the North American Free Trade Agreement. He said it will be a 6-month termination or withdrawal period. The move puts pressure on Congress to approve his New Deal U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement. President Trump told reporters that Congress will have a choice, either